Hey everyone, this is Lecture 6 for POS 273, International Relations, an online undergraduate course taught in the Political Science Department at the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So today's lecture is on the United Nations. We're taking a step away from theoretical perspectives and conceptual frameworks for a moment and focusing on one particularly important setting that you're going to be working on in the context of the simulation. So I want to give you a little bit of a backdrop for the UN Security Council, what it is, so you have some basic information and you're prepared for that simulation. You understand the mechanics of the way that it works. In order to do that, we first have to talk about international law. I think most people's framework for law is domestic law, right? Law that we have within our countries that has a clear enforcement structure. There's clear entities that are charged with creating it. And international law is a little bit different. The reason that we focus on international law is that the United Nations is one setting in which international law is created and in which the operations of the UN are driven by international law. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, just to give you kind of a background to what some of these terms mean and how to understand them. And then we'll move into the United Nations. So I'm going to talk about the United Nations very generally. The readings that you had for this week, I think, do a good job of laying out what the UN is and the story behind its creation, some of the issues with the UN and its operation, and also the UN Security Council. In particular, the chapter by Linda Fasullo that you have, I think, is a really good overview of the UN Security Council, how it's constructed and how it works. And we'll close by talking about some critiques and models for reform at the UN Security Council. So this is a very controversial organization that is not without criticism. And so we'll look into some of the criticism a little bit. So that's what we're going to cover today. To start, I want to map out something called global governance. That term came up in our discussion of the liberal theoretical framework, and they put a lot of emphasis on global governance. So I wanted to define it for you and just talk a little bit about what it is, because the UN is one setting that proponents of global governance kind of single out as very important. So global governance, to define it, it's simply the formal and informal processes and institutions that guide and control the activities of both state and non-state actors in the international system. So we'd be talking about representatives of states like the United States and Canada and Japan, but this would also be talking about NGOs, it would be talking about multinational corporations, really anyone that is operating over and above the level of the state, and even states themselves are in some ways shaped and constrained by global governance. And you notice it's global governance and not global government. That is just to say that the institutions that exist within the states, right, the executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, all of those different entities that are charged with creating and judging and enforcing the law, nothing like that exists at the international level, right? Nothing like that really operates at the international level, and so it's a slightly different process. Also have to define international institutions and international organizations, both terms that I've used in this class before. International institutions, it is tempting to think of institutions as physical entities with a location, an address. That's not really what the term means, and it can mean something very abstract. So I want to define it and be clear on what it is. International institutions are just norms, rules, and practices that prescribe behavioral roles, constrain activity, and shape expectations. These could be things like sovereignty, right? The expectation of non-interference and sovereign control that states have over what happens within their borders. That would be an example of an international institution. Obviously, sovereignty doesn't have an address. It is not an entity that exists physically in the world somewhere. But it's a very important construct, and it shapes the way that states and other actors behave in international relations. And so when we refer to it, we're talking about something that's meaningful. It's just hard to pin down exactly where it's located. International institutions can also be more specific than that. So recently we've heard a lot about the North American Free Trade Agreement, negotiated in the 1990s. This is a free trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, designed to enable freer flow of goods across borders within this region. And it's come under fire as President Donald Trump has said this is a bad deal. He wants to renegotiate it, right? So NAFTA, even though it really doesn't have an address or a location either, it is an example of a framework, an agreement that guides and shapes state behavior, constrains activity, shapes expectations. So that too would be something that we would refer to as an international institution, and arguably a very important one. International organizations are slightly different. These are physical entities. They have a location. They have an organizational structure. They have staff. They have head offices. They have letterheads and business cards, and they exist in the world, right? So examples of this would be the European Union or the International Court of Justice, NATO, the International Criminal Court, right? All of these things are organizations that exist in the world, or actually with the ICJ, that's a subunit of the United Nations. But these are physical entities that exist in the world, and states would send representatives to those organizations. Some of them are very broad, like the United Nations. Its charge, its mission encompasses really everything that's happening at the international level. Others are much more focused, right? NATO is primarily just kind of a security entity emerged out of the Cold War. But the point is that they exist tangibly in the world, and states would send representatives to those organizations. And so when we say an international organization or an IO, recognize that we are referring to something tangible that exists out there in the world. And now those settings could create international institutions. They may generate, international law and international agreements, but they are not interchangeable with international institutions. They are a physical entity. So that's just kind of some terminological stuff. When we talk about international institutions, we can talk about them at three levels. Constitutional, fundamental, which is where we'll spend most of our time, and then issue-specific or regimes. Constitutional would be, an international institution that is constitutional really defines and constitutes the parameters of international relations and what it means to be a state. So sovereignty would be an example. If we didn't have a notion of sovereignty, a notion of non-interference in a state's affairs and their autonomy and control over their own affairs, then international relations would look really different, right? It would be, as if you changed some fundamental quality of the world in which we inhabit, right? All of a sudden, gravity's not there. The world is going to look really different. If you get rid of this constitutional institution of sovereignty, the world looks really different. And we can look historically to see what a world without sovereignty looks like. And it's a very different place, constituted in a very different way. Fundamental are institutions which provide basic rules and practices that shape how states solve cooperation and coordination problems, right? So these would be things like international law, multilateralism, both of which we're going to talk about. But these are, rules and frameworks that identify how states are going to work together to address shared problems. And then regimes or issue-specific institutions are fundamental institutional practices in a particular domain of international relations. So for instance, the Geneva Convention deals with how we conduct warfare and how we treat prisoners of war. It's a very specific set of institutional practices in a very narrowly constrained area. It is not as broad and all-encompassing as something like sovereignty or the idea of international law. So when something is a set of laws, a set of agreements, a set of practices specific to an area of international relations, that's when we're into the realm of regimes. The creation of international law happens in a variety of different ways. One of the most common ways in which it happens is multilateral diplomacy. When we say multilateral diplomacy, we're simply referring to cooperation among three or more states with the goal of formulating reciprocally binding rules of conduct, meaning that they apply equally to each partner, right? It is not a more powerful state imposing something on someone else, but it's agreements that states are going to abide by and they will be affected by equally. Those are crafted in settings that are designed to facilitate that diplomacy. So this could be a summit, it could be an international organization like the EU, a regional organization like the United Nations, the European Union would be an example of a regional organization, not the United Nations, which is obviously beyond any specific region. So these are crafted in settings that are designed to facilitate diplomacy among multiple partners, and these are really the primary mechanism by which we create international law. States, it's important to note, are only obliged to observe international law to which they have consented. So if a state has not signed on to an agreement, if a state has not been a part of a negotiation and disagrees with some aspect of an agreement, then they are not bound by it. A state can even sign on to a piece of international law with certain exceptions. So they will sign on to, the majority of law, but they'll pull out a specific area and say, this we don't agree with. And usually that's done as a mechanism to get it passed by whatever mechanism they use to have their domestic government agree to it. Usually it's, the parliament or Congress or some sort of legislative body is going to approve it. And sometimes just in order to be involved with a piece of international law, they'll have to pull something out and create an exception. Otherwise, it won't get approval domestically. But it's usually some area that would be particularly controversial for that state, given their unique circumstances. One important source of law is what's called customary law. And this is law that really doesn't exist anywhere. It's not written down. It doesn't emerge as a specific agenda item in a multilateral negotiation. It just becomes custom. It becomes common practice. And as it becomes common practice over time, it becomes an expectation of states, even if it's not formally codified. So if there is some sort of international legal dispute, a country can refer to customary law, saying that this is the norm, this is the expectation in this area, and state A, B, or C is not abiding by it, which is a little bit different than domestic law, right? It would be very hard to say this person broke the law because everybody knows that you do this in this situation. You would need it to be statute. You would need it to be codified. Otherwise, somebody couldn't be held responsible for breaking that law or violating it. So international law is a slightly different domain in that respect. It is common to say that there is no way to enforce international law, and that is really not true. It is not the case that international law is unenforced. It is not the case that it is unenforceable. It is accurate, I think, to say that it is not enforced in the same way that domestic law is enforced, right? So a couple lectures ago, I used the example of like a stop sign, running a stop sign. We have a mechanism to enforce that at the domestic level. We don't really have the same mechanisms of enforcement at the global level. So there is no global police force, really. So what are the mechanisms of enforcement then? Well, one is that states are encouraged to incorporate international law into their domestic law. So if a country signs on to an environmental agreement, they sign on to that agreement, but then it filters down to the legal level at the domestic, in the domestic political arena, and eventually becomes enforced by the executive branch, executive agencies. It gets built into the domestic system of law. It could also be the case that we rely upon naming and shaming, right? International condemnation for usually very serious breaches of international law. If we think that someone has violated another state's sovereignty or they're engaged in genocide or human rights abuses, they will be publicly called out by the international community, and perhaps that will be enough for them to change their actions. Or maybe even just the threat of international condemnation will be significant enough that they won't engage in that sort of activity. It could be threats or coercive diplomacy by other states. This could be, saying that if you do this, there will be consequences. Here's what those consequences might be. So states can use their power to try and coerce or cajole states into abiding by international law. A case can be brought before international courts or international dispute settlement mechanisms. So we have the International Court of Justice, which operates through the United Nations. There's the International Criminal Court, which hears crimes against humanity and war crimes. Some major bodies related to specific areas of international relations, like the World Trade Organization, have arbitration mechanisms that are similar to courts, where that's a setting in which international law could be enforced. Then you notice we're kind of getting more into the more serious forms of enforcement. International law could be enforced by punitive measures by other states, so trade embargoes, economic sanctions, suspension of diplomatic relations. All of those things are ways to signal to countries that they are in violation of your expectations and the expectations of the international community, and to try to apply pressure to get them to change their actions. And then the very last and certainly most serious way that you can try to enforce international law is by military measures. States would decide either multilaterally or a single state would go it alone that something was such a serious breach of international law that it was deserving of some sort of military response. So we might see targeted military strikes. We might see bombing. We might even see invasion and occupation if it's a serious enough breach, right? So it is not the case, right, that international law is unenforced, that it is unenforceable. It is enforced differently than what we see at the domestic level. And in many cases, it's harder to enforce, but it's not impossible to enforce, right? And international law does have some power. It depends on the issue area. It depends on what's going on in the world. It depends on who the different actors are. But states certainly take account of international law. They don't just completely disregard it. It is not this entirely useless and ineffective pile of paper. It actually has meaning in international politics. So one of the key settings for crafting international law and attempting to enforce international law is the United Nations. And it is my hope that by the end of this class, you are familiar with the United Nations, what it is, and also some of its operations, specifically its operations related to international peace and security. And we're going to spend a lot of time with the UN Security Council, and you're going to get to play the role of a country representative to the UN Security Council. So the United Nations is a very important body. It emerged really as World War II was in full swing, and then eventually took its institutional form in the aftermath of World War II. And it is really the only thing remotely approaching a global organization with full participation of every country in the world that humankind has ever created, right? It is a very special and unique animal that has not existed for the vast majority of human history, right? It took really devastating wars and a certain degree of international coordination before we could even conceive of having something like the United Nations. It emerged out of World War II, as I said. It also emerged out of the broken shell of something called the League of Nations, which was an attempt, again, to create a global organization dealing with peace, security, economic development, and prosperity, but was really ineffective. And your brief guide to your brief introduction to the United Nations does a very good job of laying out the League of Nations, what it was, why it wasn't particularly successful, mainly because countries chose to opt out of it. Most notably, the United States was not a participant in the League of Nations. So you need to have the major powers involved if it's going to be effective. Its mission is really threefold. I would say kind of the most important flank of the United Nations relates to global peace and security. After World War II, there was a real desire to ensure that we would not careen into World War III, particularly given the fact that we were now dealing with countries that were armed with very, very powerful weapons and nuclear technology. So we wanted something to create a setting in which diplomatic negotiation could occur and the international community could respond proactively to threats to global peace and security. It also creates a lot of the contemporary law around international human rights, ensuring the rights of the individual, regardless of country. There is this notion that everyone has certain fundamental human rights by virtue of being human, and to create a setting in which we could ensure respect for international law. And then lastly, to promote economic and social progress. A huge part of the United Nations mission, and some of the areas in which the UN has been most successful and had the greatest impact, deal with underdevelopment, famine, human development crises throughout the world, responding to the needs of impoverished populations, working to mitigate against natural disasters, a whole host of different things. The mission of the United Nations is a very expansive one, and in this economic and social realm, that's where they've had some pretty significant successes. The UN's organizational structure, as you can see here, is enormous. So it's broken up into these different principal organs, and then within those principal organs, you have subsidiary bodies, functional commissions, regional commissions, other bodies, departments and offices. I mean, it is pretty complex in terms of its bureaucratic structure. I'm going to talk just about the first two of these, the General Assembly and the Security Council. But I want to make one note just before we move on to that one of the critiques of the UN is that it's overly bureaucratic, and it because of its overly bureaucratic nature, it just eats up a ton of money and doesn't really accomplish a lot. That I think is unfair, and I would really encourage you to push back against that criticism of the UN. The UN has an annual budget of about $25 billion. That is not a lot of money. That is just a fraction of some of the smallest countries in the world, what they have for an annual budget, and it is global in scope, right? What it is charged with doing is really massive. And as I said, particularly as you get into some of the economic and social areas, it's done tremendous work, right? There's tremendous accomplishments that we can point to the United Nations, particularly in human development and ensuring economic development that are really remarkable. So it operates on a shoestring budget. Yes, the organizational structure is complex, but it is complex because the world is complex, right? One of the early secretary generals, who's basically kind of the spokesperson, administrative head of the UN, when he was asked about the UN's bureaucratic structure, he said, it is a reflection of the world as it exists, right? And so, yes, it is complex and there's lots of sub-entities, but there is a lot going on in the world, and the world itself is complex. And so it's reflected in the UN structure. With that said, the UN has been a pretty controversial organization. There is a lot of sentiment that views it as unnecessary, that views it as trampling upon the national priorities of countries and not particularly effective in the work that it does. And particularly in the United States, we've seen a real pushback against the UN. The current National Security Advisor, John Bolton, was previously the ambassador to the United Nations, and he was kind of a controversial pick because he really didn't believe in the mission of the United Nations. And so we do see this sentiment among many that the UN is this unwieldy global entity that gets in the way of states doing what they want. And I think that's true, but I also think that there's an argument to be made that that is necessary. And sometimes what states want to do needs to be constrained or at least vetted by the international community. And if we didn't have the United Nations, we would not have a body that could do this. So, as I said, I'm going to go into two of these principal organs of the United Nations. First, I want to talk a little bit about the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly basically functions like a parliament. It is a one country, one vote system. So all member countries are going to get representation and an equal vote, which leads to some pretty absurd and ridiculous voting to population ratios, right? So there's an island nation in the Pacific called Tuvalu that has about 11,000 people, and they're going to get the same vote as, the representative from the United States, which represents over 300 million people. So that has come up as one of the criticisms, right? That this UN General Assembly vastly overrepresents smaller populations, kind of similar to what we see in the United States Senate, where every state, regardless of population size, is going to get 2 votes. In the United States, we have the House of Representatives, in which seats are apportioned according to population. In the UN, there's no corresponding second chamber of the General Assembly that affords votes based on population. So it is kind of interesting how that works. The UN General Assembly, its charge is to consider, deliberate, and vote on any issue within the scope of the UN Charter. And the UN Charter, I encourage you to go read. It's a very expansive document, and virtually anything could fall within the scope of the UN Charter, or at least you could make a case that it would fall within the UN Charter. In most cases, resolutions are decided by a majority vote. In certain special instances, you need a 2/3 majority vote. So if there is a resolution that's going to be passed related to peace and security, or if the UN General Assembly is deciding on the admission of new members, if there is a new member state that is petitioning to be part of the United Nations, you would need a 2/3 vote. General Assembly resolutions, these are the outcomes of these votes. These are just decisions reached by the General Assembly. They're only recommendations, right? There is no formal body within the UN that can compel states to comply with General Assembly resolutions. All you can really do, it gives you some power to say it is the will of the international community that X, Y, or Z, right? Whatever the resolution says. But it does not give you the power to really enforce them. And the UN doesn't really have that enforcement power. But it can utilize a General Assembly resolution to potentially create legitimacy for these mechanisms of enforcement, right? The mechanisms of enforcing international law, if a powerful state is so motivated to kind of get behind that and actually, push that as an action in the international arena, right? So you would generally need a state to step in and try to enforce a General Assembly resolution if it was disregarded. But that's not to say that they're meaningless, right? A General Assembly resolution is important, right? It is the will of the international community, even if it doesn't have a tangible, immediate effect. It is important that we have a body that's representative of the international community and stands as its voice. So the UN Security Council is another principal organ of the United Nations, and it is assigned the primary responsibility for the maintenance of global peace and security. This was one of the foremost concerns of the group of individuals trying to create the United Nations in the aftermath of World War II. What they were responding to was the absence of a setting in which countries that were careening towards war could be publicly called out by the international community as a whole, as opposed to individual countries, and where steps could be taken by the international community to potentially end ongoing conflict or mitigate or prevent, situations that were spiraling into a dangerous situation that was potentially going to lead to conflict or war or genocide. So currently, the UN Security Council has 15 member states. That was not the case always. Originally, it had 11 member states. But the current configuration, at least since the 1960s, I believe, is 15 member states. You have five permanent members of the UN Security Council, what are called the P5, and then you have 10 rotating members. They're elected to the UN Security Council, these rotating members, for 2-year terms. And so sometimes they're called the E10, but the P5 is the more common term that you'll hear that refers to those permanent 5 members. The permanent 5 members are the United States, the UK, France, Russia, and China. Those permanent members emerged out of World War II. They were essentially the most powerful countries in the world in the aftermath of World War II. It's safe to say that they are not any longer the most powerful countries in the world, right? There are France, for example, is kind of, it made sense in the 1940s. It doesn't necessarily make sense today. Depending on how you configure power, there are lots of really powerful countries that are not represented here. So Germany is not here. Germany was not included because it had been the antagonist in World War II and was not viewed favorably by the international community. But one could make a strong case that Germany should be on the part of the P5 now. India is another country that has a huge population, huge economic power, and is not represented. And there's entire regions that are not represented, entire continents, right? So South America does not have a permanent member. Africa does not have a permanent member who has veto power. One interesting thing to note about China is that initially, really up until the early 1970s, the representative from China was not a representative from mainland China. It was a representative from the small island that today we know as Taiwan. At the time, it was the Republic of China. But there had been this war in China in which the communists took over, right? And the communists are still in power. And the nationalists had fled to Taiwan. And the United States mainly wasn't willing to recognize the communists' China, Red China, as the legitimate voice of the Chinese people. And so for a very strange 25-year period, you had China being represented by Taiwan, what is now Taiwan, and mainland China had no formal voice within the United Nations. That changed in 1971 as part of the thaw, as part of President Nixon of the United States going to China and meeting with the Chinese leadership. And now China is actually not a member of the UN. It's one of the few countries in the world that is not part of the UN. They have some sort of contingent that they send, but they're not formally a member, largely over disputes of, who is the rightful voice of China. So that's not super relevant, but that's just kind of an aside. Now, obviously, China is represented by a representative from mainland China in the communist government there. In order for a Security Council resolution to pass, it has to get 9 votes, and it has to avoid veto by any of the permanent 5. You sometimes hear folks refer to the 6th veto. The 6th veto would be these rotating members, the non-permanent members. If they voted as a block, they could effectively vote something down. I don't know that that has ever happened. In general, vetoes are relatively rare in the UN Security Council. There was a period in which the Soviet Union was represented. It eventually became Russia, right? Russia took over that permanent seat when the Soviet Union dissolved, and they were using the veto quite a bit. But in general, vetoes are really rare, primarily because people don't propose a resolution if they know it's going to be vetoed. And the UN Security Council operates in this way in which there's a lot of agenda setting, there's a lot of things not getting to the point where it would be voted on if one of the permanent members has serious reservations and they're going to use their veto power. So it's a relatively rare thing, and even more rare than a member of the P5 using their veto power would be one of the 10 rotating members, all of the 10 rotating members using their power as a block to vote something down. I don't think that has ever happened. It's largely a conciliatory body. There's a lot of kind of reverence and respect for individuals. It generally doesn't break down in arguments or accusations, although there have been examples of that in the past, particularly when we were in the Cold War and you had the United States and the Soviet Union both represented on the council. But today it's largely kind of formal and conciliatory, and there's not a lot of fighting and disagreement and argument within the UN Security Council. And it has become more transparent over time. There was a long time in which the UN Security Council was relatively opaque, and they do a lot more inviting of non-member states into the Security Council chambers to get their point of view, inviting in individuals who might have information relevant to a decision that's being made than they have in the past. So it has evolved slightly over time. So what are the steps that the UN Security Council can take? They can engage in formal condemnation of actions that they view as threatening or destabilizing. So you can be rebuked publicly by the UN Security Council if you're doing something that's threatening the international community. They can suggest principles or frameworks for mediating or resolving a dispute. So if two countries are careening towards war, or it looks like a civil war is going to break out in a country, they can suggest potential principles for how you would resolve that dispute. They can also authorize economic sanctions, arms embargoes, or other coercive measures. So some of those more serious, heavy measures that states are going to undertake in order to signal to another state that they're doing something that the international community disagrees with, they can authorize those. They can also authorize the use of offensive military force by states. So if a state comes to the UN and says, this country is doing something that is so beyond the pale that we are going to launch a military strike against them, the UN Security Council can authorize that. And they can also authorize the deployment of a UN peacekeeping force, right? So these are the blue helmets. They go to conflict areas. Often they try to keep the peace in the aftermath of a conflict. If there's a civil war and the country is in a process of reconciliation, a UN peacekeeping force will go there to try to ensure that the peace remains. Or if there's a country that's teetering towards the edge of some sort of conflict, or there's a post-conflict situation, you might see a UN peacekeeping force there. With that said, when the Security Council authorizes a peacekeeping force, it is always dependent upon states to provide the troops and the personnel and the funding. So there is not some reserve of funds and personnel and funding that is available to the UN Security Council so that they can respond very quickly. That was originally proposed when the UN was first created. There was the proposal that there would not only be troops on standby for peacekeeping operations, but also an offensive military force that could take action in really serious situations. And there would be United Nations bases all over the world, primarily focused on air power. It was primarily going to be, air forces of members of the council were going to comprise this rapid response force. That never came to be, and there has never been the creation of some sort of standing peacekeeping force for these situations. So generally what happens is the UN Security Council authorizes a peacekeeping force, and then the UN administrators will kind of pass the hat to figure out who is going to contribute what. And as a result, there's often a lag between when a peacekeeping force is authorized and when you actually get individuals on the ground. Some countries actually really rely upon participation in UN peacekeeping forces, a lot of poorer countries, in order to keep their military busy and ensure that they have a pretty good paycheck, because oftentimes the peacekeeping forces will pay better than the domestic military. They'll want their military to be involved in these peacekeeping forces. So a number of African nations oftentimes make up these UN peacekeeping forces, mainly just because it's an economic racket for them. All right, so those are the steps that the UN Security Council can take. I want to just briefly go through some of the critiques of the UN Security Council. First and foremost is the composition of the P5, the permanent five, and the composition of the council generally, right? So as I said, the P5 reflects where the world was at in the aftermath of World War II. It is not an accurate reflection of who the most powerful and consequential countries are in the world today. And so almost, every year you hear some international actor saying that there needs to be serious reform to the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council has agreed that there needs to be serious reform. Yet we haven't seen any real change to the composition of the UN Security Council since the 1960s. We have regional disparities, groups that are not represented among the P5. We have a constellation of countries that doesn't really match the distribution of power in the world today. So there's certainly room for the council to become different in its composition, but it's one of those things that is very, very hard to change. there has been critique of the problematic effects of veto power. Even though veto power isn't often used in a formal sense, as I said, many things don't even end up being considered as resolutions or actions by the UN Security Council because they know that China or Russia or the United States would veto it, right? That they would disagree with it on some fundamental level, and so they would not want the UN Security Council to put forth that resolution. And that can have the effect of really hamstringing the UN Security Council in that they can't take up certain issues, and even if there are really crucial and critical security issues facing the world, they don't have the power to really address them because they know that members of the Security Council will veto them. The argument made for veto power is that one of the problems with the League of Nations was there was not sufficient incentive for major powers to be involved. And so veto power was originally crafted as a lesson learned from this ineffective body, the League of Nations, that was ineffective in preventing World War II. And they thought that if you had a very powerful body within the UN, the Security Council, and then you had this very powerful role of being a permanent member with veto power, that would be incentive enough to get those countries to stay involved. And they recognized that it would limit the scope of what the UN Security Council could do. But nevertheless, they pushed forward with it. And that is something that will be very, very hard to change. Whatever sort of reform happens at the UN Security Council, you'll probably still have veto power where a single country can vote no on something and then it's done. It's not going to emerge from the Security Council. The last critique is the speed and ability of the UN Security Council to act in crisis situations. The UN as a whole and the UN Security Council in general are pretty slow-moving bodies. So I mentioned that when the UN Security Council authorizes a peacekeeping force, it is wholly up to the contributions of member countries as to when you'll have boots on the ground and people in the area affected. And in general, their pace is pretty slow. Even if something that is unfolding is a crisis situation, their pace is pretty slow in responding to it. So some have argued that you need to find a way that the UN Security Council just operates more swiftly than it does currently. So there's some pretty significant critiques of the UN Security Council. The chapter that you have from Linda Fasulo's book goes into some of those in greater detail. But that's one thing to keep in mind, not only as you're thinking about the UN as a general entity, but also when you're engaged in your simulation. All right, so some models for reform. I just want to close with these. There are proposals for ways that you could reform the composition of the UN Security Council. So the current composition you have on the lower left hand there, where you have the E10 and the P5, the elected 10 members who are elected for 2-year terms, and then the permanent 5. One thing that I didn't note earlier is that among the elected 10, there is an effort to have regional representation. So the E10, within the E10, you have 3 African nations, 2 Latin American and Caribbean nations, 1 Arab nation, 1 Asian nation, 1 Eastern European nation, and then 2 Western European nations, right? So among the P5, there are huge gaps in terms of representation of the global population, right? There's no Latin America, there's no Africa, right? But within the E10, they have taken steps to ensure that there is regional representation. Whether or not that's effective, whether or not that's good enough, I'm not sure. Some alternative models are presented here. One is Model A, in which you would expand the overall membership to 24, right? You would have still the P5, right? I'm sorry. You would have the permanent 5. No, sorry. So the model in Model A is you would have 11 permanent members. You would, retain the 5 permanent members with veto, right? So only some of the permanent members would have veto. And then the remaining members would be non-permanent members who are elected on a 2-year cycle like they are currently. An alternative model is Model B, in which you expand to 24 members. You have the 5 permanent members with veto, and then you have a total of 19 non-permanent members, some of whom are elected for 2-year terms, some of whom are elected for 4-year terms. I have seen all sorts of different configurations of models for reform for the UN Security Council, all sorts of different ways in which you expand the membership, expand the representation, reconfigure veto power, try to do all sorts of different things. There is support for this, right? Even major powers who would stand to lose out from UN Security Council reform recognize the fact generally that this is in many ways not accurate and representative of what the world looks like today. But it is a very, very hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to take people who have tremendous power by virtue of an institutional arrangement and then charge them with changing that very institutional arrangement, right? So it is in many ways a reflection of the realist view, right? That states are driven by power and they're going to hang on to power and not do things willingly that will constrain or sacrifice that power. But just something to keep in mind, particularly for those of you who are going to be non-permanent members in this simulation, is that there are ways that have been proposed to think about this institutional configuration differently. So that's a quick overview to the UN Security Council. I would encourage you to read those chapters closely and feel free to return to them as we work on the simulation. If you have questions about kind of nuts and bolts and stuff like that, chances are most of that information is contained both within the Oxford Reader, the brief introduction to the United Nations, or the very short introduction to the United Nations, and then the chapter on Blackboard from Linda Fasullo. So we're going to wrap up there for this week. Do remember that you have a discussion post that is due, and I've posted some questions over on the discussion board that you can respond to, or you can choose a question of your own. For next time, we're going to be jumping into more theoretical perspectives, looking at something called constructivism, which makes the argument that many of the expectations, identities, and characteristics of the international system are shaped by social interaction, and they're really interested in the construction of international norms and how norms change over time. So I'm having you read Jennifer Sterling Foger's 5th chapter, and then this very short selection from Dresner. And then I would ask you how a constructivist perspective would interpret and understand the United Nations and its role in international politics. Chances are it would be a very different interpretation than a liberal or a realist. They would focus on different questions and be interested in different dimensions of that organization. All right, so we'll wrap up there. And I will look forward to reading your discussion posts, and we'll carry on next time with constructivism. Thanks, everybody.